Once hailed as a living icon of Las Vegas, the brain behind the witty negotiations on television is now facing an unprecedented wave of criticism. The halo of an empire that once made many admirers is gradually fading, revealing dark secrets that were thought never to be discovered. No longer are the curious antiques, no longer the exciting bargains on the small screen. Testimonies, documents, and shady connections are gradually strung together, as if painting a picture of a calculating, sophisticated, and shocking network. Can Rick Harrison escape this shock? Or is this the end of an empire that once symbolized the American dream? Watch the whole video to discover the whole truth behind this unexpected slide. The man who helped build the American dream is now accused of destroying it. To understand the moment Rick Harrison collapsed in the courtroom, we need to step back and look at the entire journey he has been on. A journey that not only reflects his success, but also is a living symbol of the classic American dream. Rick was not born into wealth. He grew up in Lexington, North Carolina, in a strict military family. His father, Richard Harrison, a former naval officer, was reserved and disciplined. Rick's childhood was shrouded in darkness by epilepsy, which he was diagnosed with at a very young age. While other children played basketball, Rick was often absent from school and isolated. His world was confined to the pages of books about war, ancient civilizations, and discarded objects. But it was those pages that opened Rick's eyes to a unique worldview, where every item had a story, and its true value lay in the history behind it. In 1981, the Harrison family moved to Las Vegas, a land of neon lights, of fleeting dreams, where money moved as quickly as dice on a table. In a world where everything could be easily consumed, Rick and his father chose a different path, against the flow of time. They opened a pawn shop where memories were bought and sold, the past was preserved and valued. Gold and Silver Pawn officially opened in 1989, in a modest house near the center of Vegas. They served all classes, from high rollers, gambling addicts, to collectors with sophisticated tastes. Rick learned to look at objects not only with his eyes, but also with his intuition and memory. A scratch could reduce the value of an item by 30%. A faded stamp could be a fake, worthless. Even before he appeared on television, Rick was a whispered name in the collector's circle. A man who could glance at a watch and recite its history, provenance, era, and global commercial value. No need to Google, because for many people, Rick Harrison is Google. In 2009, Rick Harrison rose to mainstream fame with his reality show Pawn Stars on the History Channel. The show quickly became a phenomenon, more than just entertainment. Each episode featured a vivid slice of history, an item with a story, and an engaging negotiation. Rick was more than an appraiser. He was a storyteller. He infused emotion into each item, drawing viewers beyond its material value to its story. An antique gun was no longer a weapon, but a witness to war. An 1804 silver dollar became a symbol of early American finance, and Abraham Lincoln's signature was more than just ink. It was a message from the past, echoing into the present. Pawn Stars is not an antiques show, but a history relived through the lens of a man who never graduated from college, but who has taught a nation about seemingly worthless things. Rick once said, "I don't need a degree to know what a penny is worth. I just need the story behind it." Rick quickly became an icon. He embodied the American self-made man, starting from scratch, overcoming illness, building a family business, becoming a TV star, writing best-selling books, and appearing on popular talk shows. He was not a tech billionaire, but he represented millions of working Americans, people who pinched pennies, shouldered the responsibilities and dreams of the middle class. And so, when news broke that Rick had been convicted of involvement in an international smuggling ring, the shock was not just cultural, but a seismic shock. A man once hailed as America's unofficial history teacher was now in the dock, facing charges of involvement in one of the most heinous crimes of the 21st century. Could Rick have known and still participated? Or was he simply a victim of his own blind faith in the provenance of the items he had traded? The fallout didn't begin with the verdict. It began insidiously before, when the first shady items appeared in the shop, when history, rather than truth, became a cover. And like any classic tragedy, Rick Harrison's journey is a journey into darkness, not because he's evil, but because he's come to believe so deeply in the very thing he's preached to America for years. Every object has a story. But if that story is twisted, can the teller still remain innocent? When history becomes a mask, relics are no longer evidence, they're fabrications. In Rick's world, every old object carries a soul, a past, a piece of history. But as Rick himself warned in an episode of Pawn Stars, history can lie, and if you're not careful, it will lie to you. Little did he know that this very statement would later become a bitter prophecy for his life. Because like so many of life's long slides, trouble never comes all at once. It creeps in quietly, bit by bit, until there's no turning back. It started with a small stone statue from Greece, whose provenance the seller was tight-lipped about. Then a hand-painted antique map that doesn't appear in any public archives. Then a jade-encrusted pocket watch, said to have belonged to a post-war Eastern European official. Over time, Rick's trades became increasingly bizarre, as if they came from another world, incredibly valuable but with no reason to exist. What's puzzling is that every item comes with proper documentation. For a store like Gold and Silver Pawn Shop, where hundreds of items are inspected and traded every day, it's understandable that some dubious items come up. Rick and his team often work with experts, use cutting-edge technology, and cross-reference international databases. But as in any industry, when you put your trust in process and ignore your instincts, you create a fatal blind spot. An internal investigation report later submitted to court found that between 2017 and 2021, more than 142 artifacts, each worth more than $10,000, had been sold from Rick's shop that did not meet the provenance standards required by museums. Of those, 37 were on Interpol's watch list, but the alerts came too late, or were out of sync with internal checks. A technological flaw that, combined with a near-absolute reliance on paperwork on the part of sellers, allowed illicit goods to slip into legitimate trade channels. What makes this story even more shocking, these items were not simply counterfeits or stolen. According to the federal indictment, some of them were used as underground currency in international human trafficking transactions. In other words, the statues, maps, and clocks were more than just collectibles. They were tools that were traded for goods or ransom. One example came in May 2019, when an Eastern European woman claiming to be a collector brought in a Byzantine necklace. Rick personally handled the transaction and approved the $26,000 price after reviewing the authenticity certificate from a private museum in Prague. But the investigation later revealed that the necklace was part of a stolen collection, one that was tied to the harrowing story of a victim who had been trafficked to the United States. The woman, Elena, became a key witness in the trial, recounting how she was treated like a commodity, traded for a historical artifact. It was even more chilling to learn that Rick had a feeling something was wrong. In a leaked internal interview, he confessed, "Sometimes I have a gut feeling that something is wrong. Not fake, but wrong. But the paperwork is good, the value is high, and we are not the FBI." It was this choice, to trust the system over intuition, that set Rick on a path of regret. The three fateful items, according to the latest leaked police documents related to the shocking case, began in August 2020. That day, a middle-aged man of Hungarian origin showed up at the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop. He was polite, well-dressed, and carrying a luxurious ebony box bound in leather. Inside was an ancient Bible, believed to have been printed in the 17th century in Transylvania. The book was intact with its classic leather cover, handwritten notes in Latin, and an envelope containing a document of authenticity stamped by a Romanian museum. The book was of great religious, cultural, and historical value to Eastern Europe. The man spent more than 40 minutes examining every detail, from the handwriting, the paper type, the cover structure, to the printing technique, all of which seemed to be perfect. When the seller offered $38,000, Rick didn't haggle. He agreed immediately, put himself in the transaction, and added the book to his private collection, a collection of extremely rare or highly confidential items. Unbeknownst to Rick, however, that same day, an undercover officer from the Federal Human Trafficking Task Force, HTTF, had secretly followed the Hungarian man from the airport to the store. The man had been under investigation for months for his suspected involvement in an international money laundering network through antiques transactions. Just 4 days later, Rick received an official letter from the FBI requesting information about the item he had just purchased. The letter didn't specify a reason, only that the item was under international investigation. Accustomed to working with museums and archaeological organizations, Rick wasn't worried. He confidently sent the entire transaction file, including photos of the book and a portrait of the seller, to the FBI. But questions began to arise at FBI headquarters. How did an artifact linked to a Balkan human trafficking ring end up in the hands of Rick Harrison, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail when it came to high-value transactions? Was Rick really unaware, or was this part of a larger conspiracy? A covert investigation was launched. Federal agents began scrutinizing the store's transaction records. What they discovered shocked everyone. The ancient Bible wasn't the first suspicious purchase. Over the course of 2 years, at least 11 artifacts from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Caucasus region had been purchased through shady deals, mostly by Rick or 3 of his closest associates. Investigators believe the Bible was the first link in the chain of custody that led to the artifact's entire journey, from the black market to the gold and silver shop, then to prestigious auction houses or private collectors. A closed-loop pattern emerged in which stolen or illegally traded artifacts were laundered through intermediaries, and Rick's shop became the perfect filter to legitimize everything. The situation began to get more serious. Rick was repeatedly subpoenaed for records and details of transactions, but in public, everything continued as normal. The Pawn Stars show continued to air with familiar scenes. Rick gave pointed remarks about muskets, wartime aircraft parts, and other antiques, as if nothing had happened. However, those closest to him, especially his son, Corey Harrison, began to sense that something was amiss. In a private conversation with his attorney, Corey confessed that he had become extremely cautious, even re-examining items he had sold last year. Not because he was afraid of making a mistake, but because he feared that something had been overlooked. Rick began staying up all night, rereading old documents, calling experts who had worked with him to verify information, but all his efforts were too late. In March 2021, the FBI officially announced that Gold and Silver Pawn was under investigation for suspected involvement in an international human trafficking and money laundering network. Rick Harrison was no longer a bystander. He was the central figure in a federal investigation that demanded clarification of the extent of his involvement in the whole affair. The story is no longer about a few lost antiques. It has become a dark portrait of the links between a reality TV icon and one of the most sophisticated criminal networks across Europe and the United States. The public is still in the dark. Rick has not been arrested, but he knows one thing. The game is on, and he, perhaps unknowingly, is the trump card of a shadowy force in the world of antiquities trading, where a Roman coin can determine a person's life and an 18th century map can cover up a human trafficking operation. The lines between legal and criminal are blurring after a fateful Bible reading accidentally drags Rick Harrison into the crosshairs of federal investigators. The pressing question is Rick an insider or just an unwitting pawn in a game he can't even fathom? According to an unofficial source, the FBI has identified a group of customers from certain countries, individuals who always carry extremely valuable antiques with full documentation and regularly deal directly with Rick or through an intermediary named Victor Mick Merrick. This name first appeared on a watch transaction invoice in 2018, and since then, like a shadow, he has continuously appeared in a series of transactions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The strange thing is that Merrick has never appeared in any TV episode. Rick has never mentioned him publicly, and he is not on the official employee list. However, in the internal system, his name is saved as a VIP reference. A deeper investigation revealed that Merrick was a young Czech citizen who had worked as an antiquities expert for a private gallery in Vienna, who had disappeared from the art world in 2015 after a $1.2 million art forgery scandal. Since then, no one knew where Victor Merrick had gone until recently. High-end antiquities transactions continued from Istanbul to London, from Prague to Las Vegas, all marked by a slanted M with 3 lines across it, a mysterious signature that appeared to be the symbol of a hidden network. Some sources claim that the FBI suspected Merrick was the man in the shadows, the man behind the creation of the perfect cover for the sale of human trafficking. Rick, investigators say, may have met Merrick early on and may not have even known his true identity. To Rick, Merrick was just a shrewd broker who always brought in great deals and had extensive connections in the industry. Rick was driven by instinct, an investigator noted in an internal report, and Merrick had perfect paperwork. That's why Rick trusted him and why he was drawn in. This is not simply the story of a businessman taking risks for profit. It's the tragedy of a man manipulated by his own confidence in his intuition and expertise. The clearest evidence is a series of emails exchanged between Rick and Merrick, under the alias M-Hawk, via the encrypted Proton Mail service. In them, Rick expresses his suspicions. "I don't feel good about the Mesopotamian mask. It looks like the one that was stolen from the museum last year." Merrick reassures him. "Verified, it comes from a private collection in Georgia. It's completely legitimate. Don't worry too much." This suggests that Rick may have had his doubts, but decided to proceed anyway, perhaps out of trust in Merrick's assurances, or pressure to maintain his own reputation. After all, Rick couldn't keep turning down artifacts that would become the focus of future episodes of the show. Rick's situation was becoming increasingly difficult, not just legally, but morally. A baker doesn't need to know where his wheat came from, but an antiquities dealer couldn't say the same when faced with transactions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The academic community began to debate. Was Rick a victim or an unwitting accomplice? When you claim to know the provenance of every item you sell, a UCLA art history professor told The Atlantic, you can't escape responsibility when one of those items turns out to be a clue to a crime against humanity. What particularly puzzled investigators was Rick's silence. Maybe he had doubts, maybe he had concerns, but he never reported anything. And that silence turned him from a potential witness to a prime suspect. Was Rick trying to protect his brand? Was he afraid that if he admitted he couldn't tell what was legal and what was illegal, he would lose the edge that made him famous? Or was there something deeper, something Rick knew but chose not to reveal? In this fog of suspicion, only one thing was certain. The game had begun, and Rick Harrison was in the middle of it. A surprising clue emerged. A security camera footage from the store showed Merrick entering with an unidentified veiled woman who was later identified as a victim of human trafficking from Bulgaria. They had no items with them. No transactions were made. There was only a 7-minute conversation in Rick's private office. The camera recorded no audio, just gestures and body language, inconclusively, but enough to raise suspicions that Rick might know more than he was admitting. If true, Rick's image would be shattered. The public would no longer be able to believe in his absolute innocence, and those who once idolized him would now be divided into 2 camps, defense or condemnation. And Rick? He remained silent. No interviews, no social media posts, quietly preparing for a legal battle. Because he knew this was more than a lawsuit. It was a battle for his reputation, his career, his legacy. The press had never gathered in Las Vegas federal court. From local news stations to CNN, from the New York Times to June, they were all there. Rick Harrison, who had once brought knowledge and laughter to millions on television, now sat silently in the dock. His pale gray suit did not hide his fatigue. His once witty eyes were lifeless. The cameras were no longer focused on him as a star, but as a fallen symbol. U.S. Attorney Sandra Rivas wasted no time. In her opening statement, she made it clear. Rick Harrison was not just a negligent businessman. He was a link in the chain of legalization of human trafficking-related goods, and that was not by accident, but by design. She presented a summary of 73 suspicious transactions over 5 years, totaling more than $3.8 million, of which at least 16 items were directly linked to illegal human trafficking operations across Europe and Latin America. The courtroom grew tense as images of the victims, women and children, flipped across the screen. Some would testify, others were missing. Rick bowed his head, avoiding the screen. Some in the room began to cry. The items that had appeared on Pawn Stars, once celebrated as entertaining, were now painful reminders of human tragedy. The lines between television and reality were now blurred in a chilling way. Rick's defense attorney, Charles Denning, a veteran prosecutor, took a different tack. He did not deny that there had been suspicious transactions, but he argued that Rick ran a business that made thousands of transactions a year. He was not a cop, had no access to immigration records, and had no international investigative skills. Rick, according to Denning, was simply the victim of sophisticated, organized criminals who were exploiting his fame and his need for television. The lawyers presented evidence that Rick had cooperated with law enforcement, had turned down several suspicious items, and had expressed doubts about a statue only to be told by experts that there was no reason to disprove it. But for Prosecutor Rivas, the fact that Rick had doubts and continued to doubt them was the key issue. "He's not naive," she said. "He's smart, and it's that smartness that makes him dangerous, because he knows how to legitimize wrongdoing without leaving a trace." The battle was now not just legal, but also about image. The prosecution portrayed Rick as cold, calculating, silent to protect his brand. The defense argued that he was unwittingly drawn into a global criminal network, and the public, they watched from behind screens or outside the courthouse. And they were divided. Some believed Rick was a victim of the underworld. Others believed he was part of it. And then, a game-changing moment. One of the victims, Elena, the Eastern European woman named in the indictment, stepped to the witness stand. She described being trafficked across borders, held captive, and traded for an antique, a Byzantine necklace that had appeared on a 2020 episode of Pawn Stars. "I watched him, Rick Harrison, hold it, admire it, joke about its beauty, but he didn't know. It was the price of my freedom." The courtroom fell silent. Rick raised his head for the first time, looking directly at her. In his eyes, no more defiance, no more tears, just an unspeakable weight. Rick's attorney immediately objected, arguing that there was no evidence he knew the necklace's true origins. But in the court of public opinion, the damage had been done. It was no longer about numbers or artifacts. Now it is about the pain of anonymous people caught up in the machine of greed and silence. In the final tense days of the trial, an unlikely witness took the stand, Rick's son and longtime reality TV companion, Corey Harrison. With his father's eyes filled with a last shred of hope, Corey stood tall, cool, and composed. "I told my dad that some of the stuff wasn't right," he said. "But he told me not to let my emotions get in the way of my work. Maybe I should have been more assertive. Maybe I was partly to blame." The testimony was a blow to the hearts of those still clinging to Rick's innocence, a final emotional blow to a trial that had teetered on the edge of truth and belief. Rick said nothing more. The press called it the trial of a generation, a moment when television viewers were forced to confront a harsh reality. Their idol might not be a hero, but just a human being, flawed, conflicted, and possibly dangerous. And so the question hangs in the air. Is Rick Harrison the culprit, or is he just a victim in a scheme so elaborate that even he can no longer tell truth from lies? 6 people who were once a family, now torn apart by testimony and betrayal. If forensic evidence is the sharp knife of justice, then the testimony of relatives is the dagger aimed at the deepest part of Rick's heart, faith. The courtroom is no longer simply a place for criminal trials. It is where each personal relationship, each emotional bond that once supported Rick, begins to crumble. The testimony of Corey, his son and close associate on a journey that has lasted for decades, is like a cold cut into the silence. Corey didn't scream, didn't cry, just said in a flat, almost emotionless voice, "I warned you about the Eastern European stuff. So perfect, so flawless, so unexpected. But you said as long as the paperwork was legal, it was fine." The room fell silent. Rick didn't react, just leaned back, like a man finally accepting that his best-kept wound had been exposed. To the public, Corey's words sounded coldly matter-of-fact, even a little like an attempt to save his father by drawing a line. "I told you, but I can't control you." But to Rick, it was a cruel moment. He was no longer protected, not even by the person closest to him. And Corey wasn't the only one. Many of the veteran employees at the Gold and Silver store, whom Rick once considered a second family, also began to quietly withdraw their support, leaving him alone amid a wave of harsh judgment not only from the law, but also from the people. Chum Lee, real name Austin Lee Russell, who once brought laughter to the audience every week, was completely absent from the trial. He did not make any public statements. According to multiple media sources, Chum Lee quietly left Las Vegas, choosing to keep absolute silence to avoid being drawn into a lawsuit that could seriously affect his personal image. The atmosphere between the people who once built the show's brand is now thick with tension. People who once called each other brothers, who used to laugh on TV, now hire their own lawyers, keep their distance, and walk away from the empire that Rick spent more than 3 decades building. One of the store's financial managers, when invited to testify, admitted, "We had our doubts, but Rick always handled the big transactions himself. He trusted his intuition more than any system. The intuition that once made him famous now became his Achilles heel. To make matters worse, rumors began to spread that one of the shady deals, the sale of an Egyptian goddess statue, might be linked to a transnational crime ring. Despite no direct evidence, investigative bloggers suggested that the deal had been done through Rick's son, Corey, through his personal connections. Though his name was not on any of the contracts, speculation swirled, raising the question. Was there a secret deal between father and son, and Corey was now backing away to save himself? Corey denied it all, saying through his attorney that he had no involvement in any illegal activity and was willing to cooperate with independent investigations. But for Rick, the damage was done. In a leaked video of him leaving the courtroom, Rick bowed his head, turned to his attorney with a somber look and asked, "If my son doesn't trust me, then what am I left with?" These are no longer the words of a defendant. They are the whispers of a father who is slowly losing everything, a man who once stood in the shadow of fame, now watching his loved ones slowly fade away, as slowly as in a broken dream. But there is one thing that is remarkable. No one in Rick's family, not even Corey, has ever directly accused him of intentionally breaking the law. The story is not about the obvious crime, but about a deeper fault. Rick's blind confidence in his own judgment, ignoring warnings, and overlooking danger signs. That paints an even more poignant picture of the tragedy. Rick is not a bad man, but a smart man. But his unwavering belief in himself has led him to drag those closest to him out of their comfort zone into a storm from which no one can escape. Media analysts have identified this as the turning point in the case. If Rick were a schemer, the story would be much simpler, but he is not. Rick is a father, a mentor, a leader, and an inspiration to countless others. As those close to him begin to turn against him, the painful question becomes not whether he is guilty, but when did Rick lose his identity in the public eye? His downfall is not just the image of a man facing trial, but the collapse of a value system. From family relationships to work relationships to the audience that has always considered Rick a familiar friend, all are now tested. This split is perhaps more painful than any accusation from the outside. Often, empires collapse under pressure from the outside, but in Rick's case, it collapsed from within, in the very place he thought was safest. The 7 truths have been revealed, but truth in a trial is not just a series of objective facts. It is a synthesis of the opinions, evidence, testimony, and persuasions of each side. For Rick Harrison, the final days of the trial were not just about coming to terms with what happened, but also about accepting the truth that the court and the public will choose to believe. As the prosecution continued to present evidence of suspicious transactions originating in areas notorious for human trafficking, the defense argued that Rick was no saint. He was a businessman, a television personality, a father, and he made mistakes not out of malice but out of overconfidence in his own judgment. The biggest blow, however, came from a leaked internal surveillance report that revealed that at least 3 security camera recordings had been deleted from the store's system within 48 hours of major transactions involving Victor Merrick. An IT employee called to testify said he had been ordered by senior management but could not confirm whether Rick had given the order directly. It was a detail the prosecution quickly seized on to raise suspicions. In a business that records everything, how could important footage be missing? Was it a system error or intentional? Rick may not have deleted the videos himself, but why didn't he investigate when he discovered the missing data? Rick remained silent for most of the trial, but at one point he said something that brought the courtroom to a halt. "If I'm wrong, I'll pay. But if I'm right and still get convicted, then maybe the system needs to rethink how it defines guilt." His words weren't loud, but they cut to the heart of the debate. Was Rick guilty, or was he just a man caught in a legal maze where negligence can be seen as willful? Rick's legal team proposed a last-ditch strategy, accepting some civil liability in exchange for a lighter criminal sentence. This is a common tactic in major criminal cases, where criminals plead guilty to avoid the risk of a lengthy prison sentence. According to inside sources, Rick could face up to 25 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts. However, if he pleads guilty to the lesser charges and cooperates, he could serve just 3 to 5 years in prison and then try to rebuild his reputation. On the eve of the trial, a surprise figure appears at Rick's lawyer's office. A woman dressed in black and wearing a hat that obscures half her face introduces herself as Lloyda Miller, a former victim of human trafficking who is now a legal resident of the United States. She brings with her a recording of a conversation she had with Victor Merrick in 2020, in which Merrick explicitly states, "Rick would never know he thought he was dealing with a museum. No one suspects smart people." Although the recording cannot be officially admitted into evidence due to its illegal origins, it is enough to make Rick realize a hard truth. He may have been manipulated. But will this matter when he faces the consequences the next morning? When the day of judgment arrives, Rick stands before the court, preparing to make his final statement. He had to decide whether to accept the plea deal or face a public verdict, with all the risks that entailed. After days of deliberation, Rick chose to reject the plea deal. "I would rather be convicted of trusting the wrong person than live the rest of my life in shame for lying to save my life," he declared, looking straight at the prosecutor. The court fell silent, the jury retired to deliberate, and Rick, in his familiar silver suit, stood there, his gaze no longer that of an appraiser of property, but of one being appraised by society. Now, the price he would pay could be freedom or death. For 8 hours, the jury deliberated after nearly 3 weeks of intense trial. During that time, Rick sat quietly in the waiting room at the back of the courtroom, holding a briefcase in his hand, inside of which was only a notebook filled with questions he had asked porn stars. No lawyers by his side, no cameras, just him, a 58-year-old man who once ran a television empire, now waiting to see how his life will continue beyond this world, or whether it will end behind bars. Finally, the verdict was announced. We, the jury, find the defendant Rick Harrison guilty. Those short words were like a knife cutting through the air. A faint sob echoed from the back row, but Rick did not collapse, did not let his emotions dominate. He just exhaled, as if finally the verdict was no longer the scariest thing, but the confirmation that everything was truly over. If you feel this story deserves more attention, don't forget to leave a comment below and share this video. To not miss unsolved cases, fascinating stories about legendary figures and mysteries that have not been revealed in the media, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We will be back with more dramatic stories.